Now, we've been talking about discrimination and segregation in the South and in the issues in the North as well. But let's move out west for a while because it would be a mistake to think that there was any portion of the country that was absolutely perfect and there was no issues whatsoever. In the West, you're going to have very similar problems as well. Keep in mind that you do have things like going back on stuff we've already looked at, like the Chinese Exclusion Act or the Gentleman's Agreement, the idea of preventing different people from coming into the United States. So there's going to be some issues of discrimination in the West as well. Now, in the interest of full disclosure, I think I've mentioned this a couple of times before. My wife was born and raised in Mexico City. She moved to the United States when she was in about seventh grade. She went through and learned English in the schools here and whatnot. We've been married for over 20 years now. About 5 years ago, she did get her U.S. citizenship. So I just always like throwing that out at the beginning of this, talking about issues in the West just because. Now, keep in mind that at the turn of the century, Mexican Americans in the West faced some very similar treatments. It was a lot like what was going on back east, except instead of it being white versus black, you had a lot of things in regards to Mexican Americans. Okay, it was in the 1880s and the 1890s when the railroads were really expanding into the Southwest. They hired a large number of Mexican immigrants to work on the rail lines. Now remember, this is a point in time when the railroads are really booming. They're trying to build more and more lines to cover more and more area. We found out later that they overbuilt. Remember, we talked about that. But in this case, they're going through and they're hiring people to continue to build these rail lines. And this is going to be going through Arizona, New Mexico, places like that. So you can think out in the desert and what have you. So you have railroad companies. Back in the 1860s, they had hired Chinese laborers to come over and help get through the Sierra Nevadas and build the railroad. Well, now in the 1880s and 90s, they're going to hire Mexican-American workers to help build the train lines down in the southwestern part of the nation. Now, they went through and they hired Mexican-Americans because they felt they were more accustomed to the hot, dry climate. They felt that this was not going to be a huge difficulty for them or whatnot, that you weren't taking somebody from, say, the northeastern U.S. where it's a cooler climate and they have humidity all the time to a hot, dry environment, as opposed to people who are, for lack of a better term, used to that, acclimated to it. They thought that this would make a better working environment for the people there, and it would just end up allowing more work to get done. So they went through and they would hire various people to work on the rail lines, in the southwestern portion. Now, the managers at the time also believed that they could pay Mexicans less than other ethnic groups. Kind of the same thing that you saw in the 1860s, where they were able to hire Chinese and Irish workers at a lower price than anyone else. Same kind of thing is going on here. Now, some of this was being done because there were people who thought they were better than, but there was also some of this was being done because they were trying to save a buck. It was seen as the more cost-effective way to go about building the railroad, and as such, there were those who were willing to go through and do things that way. However, this was not going to work out very well. You're going to end up with some resentment. You're going to end up with some very unhappy workers, and generally speaking, you're going to see some of the same issues starting to boil up out in the West that you would in the South or the North. Really, we're looking at human beings at this point in time from all sides that are beginning to kind of grate on one another, that the actions being taken by some are really causing grief that they may not see at the outset, they may not see in the immediate future, but it is something that is coming further and further down the line. Now, this was also a point in time when you would see Mexicans playing a very large and important role in the Southwest's mining and farming industries. Okay, you think about the Southwest, it really is a treasure trove of mineral riches. There's a lot of stuff down there to be had, copper and things along those lines. But at the same time, think about how difficult the working conditions would be. You also do have the ability to farm in that area. Again, the farming is not as easy because you have to bring in the water, but the same could be said about the Central Valley. So you're seeing people going through and they're raising crops, they're going through and they're mining, and they're really helping to build up the economy. all of these things are happening at essentially the same time. So you do have all of these different needs within the nation for food, for manufactured goods, for the raw materials and all that. And you go where the work is, as the saying goes. Okay? So the problem, however, is that on a number of these different crops, things like grapes, lettuce, citrus, oranges, lemons, stuff like that, required a large amount of labor. Okay, this was a very labor-intensive industry in the Southwest at this time. Now, yes, we have talked about the fact that you had all sorts of new mechanical devices coming through and making life better for everybody. But at the same time, that doesn't always trickle all the way down. So in this case, in the Southwest, you're seeing a lot of industry within, or a lot of agriculture with a great need for labor. And as such, the people who are doing the hiring are going to look wherever they can find people willing to do the work. My family moved out to California during the Dust Bowl because, people were willing to pay 25 cents an hour to pick crops, and that's how my family came to California. We came out here to work the fields. Same kind of thing is going on here. You have people that are moving north in order to do the work that people are hiring them for in regards to the mining and farming. A lot of this labor was going to be provided by Mexican immigrants. You go through, and any time that you have some kind of a boom, you will see people moving to wherever the jobs are. And people move to where the jobs are to try and provide for their family. Like I said, that's how my folks, or not my folks, but my grandparents got out here from, back east. And so as a result, people are getting hired, they're doing the work, they're not getting the best of conditions, they're not getting the best pay, but a lot of people would be looking at that it was better than nothing. That's how my grandparents ended up out here. So you go through and you're looking at what's happening in the West. You're not seeing right off the same kind of discrimination in regards to where you could live and having to step off the street and things like that. But at the same time, you're doing very, very hard labor in very harsh conditions and oftentimes getting paid less than anybody else would. And again, this is the kind of thing that is going to continue to bubble up, to permeate what's going on in the world at this time. And eventually it will reach some kind of a breaking point. We'll see that coming up later on. But it was something, like I said, we can't just say that the South was where a problem was. There were issues everywhere. And again, as I keep emphasizing, you've got to go through and you have to learn your history. You have to go through and understand what mistakes were made in the past to make sure we don't make them again. I've said it several times already. Just remember, history is about studying the good, the bad, and the ugly. In this case, we're looking in this whole little section here at some of the ugly, but it's important to know it so that we don't make the same mistakes again later. Now, in talking about some of the things that were going on at this point in time, you did have a number of individuals moving north to work fields, mining, etc., whatever jobs that could be found. And oftentimes they ended up going into debt for the people for whom they were working. They had to pay rent or different things like that. And the landowners often forced Mexicans to repay those debts before they could actually go off and find another job. Now, you can understand, on the one hand, the argument saying that, well, that makes sense, that, if money was owed, you should pay it back. But on the other hand, if you're getting paid less than anybody else and getting charged more for, a quote-unquote home to live in, then that is going to come back to be a real problem, okay? You're going to end up owing a lot more than you could ever possibly make. And if you're not supposed to leave until you can pay off that debt, then for all intents and purposes, you're stuck there forever. It is almost like slavery. Now, this was called debt peonage, and it was applied to both Mexican and African Americans. It basically went through, and what it did at best was something called indentured servitude. Now, indentured servitude goes back to colonial times. If you lived in England, you could basically get passage to the New World by agreeing to work for somebody for X number of years once you arrived in the colonies. Well, it's the same kind of thing here. It would be the equivalent of going through and basically indenturing yourself that you are now forced to work for this person doing whatever for a considerable amount of time. And the issue is that's at best. The issue at worst It was slavery, like I said. It was essentially saying that you are not allowed to leave until you have paid me back for fill in the blank, but you're never going to earn a sufficient amount of money to pay back the debt. If you have a debt that each month accrues $15 interest, and all you do is pay $10 on that debt, well, each month then you're $5 further and further in debt. And at that rate, you will never be able to escape it. And that could be true today. There are those who make the argument that that's true about credit cards today. But in this case, it was, like I said, at the best, indentured servitude. At worst, it was slavery. And this went on, this debt peonage, until about 1911. In 1911, a case comes before the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court rules that this is actually a violation of the 13th Amendment. Now, the 13th Amendment was the amendment to the Constitution which outlawed slavery in the United States. So the Supreme Court saw this as not at its best, indentured servitude, but they saw it only at its worst. The Supreme Court ruled that you could not do that this was an illegal practice, that it was a violation of the 13th Amendment. And so you can see that, yes, there are different times that the Supreme Court has made pin-headed decisions, and I point that out with Plessy versus Ferguson. But there are other times when they see what's happening, and they will actually go through and get everything, fixed as best they possibly can. In this case, with the debt peonage, they were able to actually fix things. They were able to actually go through and change what was happening to people. So sometimes you just have to take the bitter with the sweet. Sometimes you're going to see great decisions and sometimes you'll see poor ones. But also keep in mind, this was in 1911. So we're talking about 13 years after the Plessy decision. You're going to have different people on the Supreme Court at that time, and different people make different decisions. Now, in addition to all of this, remember that this is where we started off with the Chinese Exclusion Act way back in the 1800s. Okay? Now think about it. This time frame, we're talking about late 1800s, early 1900s. We've talked about how many millions of people around this time have come into the U.S. from various places around the world. By 1880, you had more than 100,000 Chinese immigrants were living in the United States. Okay, now some of these folks had come over because of jobs with the railroad. They had been offered employment and they were ready to take it. Others had come over to lend support services to people, filling various needs. Whenever somebody opens a business, it's because they see some need that needs to be fulfilled. And so there were a number of folks who came from China in order to do exactly that. They didn't come necessarily to work on the railroad or to mine for gold or anything, but to provide maybe it's shovels to the miners or something along those lines. So by 1880, you've got 100,000 or so Chinese immigrants living in the United States. And when the economy tanked around that time, you also have to take into account that there were a lot of white workers who were very afraid of losing their jobs to these immigrants. Now, we talked about this before, that this was a point in time where the Chinese immigrants were quite willing to work for far less than their white counterparts. And if push comes to shove, if you're a business and you have the choice between paying somebody $1 to do a job and 50 cents to do a job, these are just random numbers I'm choosing, then a lot of times, if you're just looking at the bottom line, you'll go with the 50 cents instead. So there were those very concerned that the Chinese would take their jobs, and as such, that's why we get things like the Chinese Exclusion Act that we talked about previously. Now, the Chinese workers, and we also talked about this, would end up living in segregated neighborhoods. You've heard this story before of African Americans moving north. They would have kids would have to attend segregated schools. We talked about this with San Francisco and the Gentleman's Agreement. So you're finding that throughout the country, there are some good and there are some bad that's happening. I know this is one of those sections that what we're focusing on is really the more negative than anything else. But again, we have to learn our history. Okay, this was a point in time where people had different laws in place, or they had different customs in place. And have we learned from these mistakes? Yes, absolutely. Have things gotten better? Yes, in my opinion, they have. Are we a perfect world like in Star Trek? No, we're not there yet. But are we constantly trying to move toward that? Yes, I would argue we are. Learning our history, seeing what had happened in the past, seeing the discriminations that have gone on and how people have reacted to them, that benefits all of us. That allows all of us to see where we can go, what we can do, how we can get there, and how we as a people can be a better people as long as we keep moving forward.